Blessings, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. This will be just a solo podcast with me, and I'll be discussing why I left traditional Latin Mass Roman Catholicism for Orthodoxy. This is also the title of an essay from that I published on my website, and I will post the link to that in the video description for this podcast that I am going to place on YouTube and Rumble. I will be going off of a notebook here in case I'm looking down a lot, and I will be showing some slide pictures. So let's start. Okay, it seems like I always begin in the same place, San Francisco. Well, that was where I was born and where I was raised, where I've spent most of my life here in the Bay Area. I was born in 1969, which was an interesting year. The big events were the Manson murders, Woodstock, and the Stonewall riots. Kind of a bad omen for things to come. But also in 1969, Pope Paul VI officially promulgated the Novus Ordo, and the Novus Ordo is Latin, I suppose, for the new Mass or the new order of the Mass, as opposed to what was in place in Roman Catholicism before, which was the Tridentine or the traditional Latin Mass or the TLM, which I never knew. I only knew the Novus Ordo Mass in the vernacular, in that case, in English. The Novus Ordo was a radical deconstruction of the liturgy. And part and parcel of that in the post-Vatican II era or the post-conciliar era was also a deconstruction of religious life. And it was actually just decimated between from 80,000 to 100,000 Catholic priests left the priesthood following the council. Sisters and nuns abandoned their convents. 90,000 left after the council. If you compare in terms of sisters and nuns, they abandoned their convents. 90,000 left. The religious life, if you compare that to now, there's about 50,000 today. So, I mean, more left than are still there today. And it's interesting that, me growing up in San Francisco in the post 60s era of the 70s and 80s, at the same time, there was just a radical reconstruction or deconstruction of society in general. And it was very much sort of centered in San Francisco. We had the sexual revolution, the counterculture, the summer of love. And this really mirrored what was taking place in the Roman Catholic Church. I always say that society, I think, is downstream from the church or religion or the spiritual life. Gregorian chants, which I had never known. I actually discovered Gregorian chant in the gay disco, but I'll talk about that later, many years after this. Gregorian chants were replaced by the St. Louis Jesuits. Here they are, which I had to grow up with. Really awful, makes me nauseous. Probably one of the most famous songs was by Dan Shute here, and that's Here I Am, Lord, which we were forced to sing over and over again. The altars were stripped, churches were desecrated. There was really an instinctual, I think, revulsion. Whoops, excuse me. There was an instinctual revulsion to this. There was a desire for the sacred and for what was beautiful. But as children in parochial Catholic schools, as a kid, what was forced upon us was this wimpy, hippie Jesus from like Jesus Christ Superstar or Godspell. And what was taught to us were social justice, not devotions, not prayers, but it was all social justice. One of the, probably one of the most interesting memories I have from childhood in Catholic schools was First Communion. And what stands out about it for me now is that the teacher emphasized how we were to approach the priest when we were to receive communion. And that was with our hands folded like this. And for some of the, squirrely kids, maybe like me, she placed a round piece of paper, construction paper, in our hands, and we were told, you got to keep that there. You can't drop, if you unclasp your hands, you'll drop it because we don't want to bump the priest or knock into the chalice or anything. And that was what was emphasized to me. I remember that. And then a year later, we were told, no, you have to receive communion like this in the palm of your hand. This sort of arbitrary decision was made by the hierarchy, obey without any explanation. And that's pretty much how the Catholic Church works. In 1989, well, I wanted to go to UC Berkeley. I was really drawn to a lot of the radicalism of the 1960s. And I was to the free love movement and all of that stuff. I was questioning who I was and I was questioning my identity. So all of those things really attracted me. And I wanted to go to Berkeley or Cal. And here it is right here, the Golden Gate Bridge right here and the Campanili Tower. And this is where I spent a good 5 years of my life, 4 years at the college before I moved across the bay, Alcatraz here, before I moved across the bay over into San Francisco. Well, in 1989, there was an art exhibition of Byzantine iconography from Greece, and it was the Legion of Honor. There's two museums in San Francisco, the Legion of Honor, which houses European art, and the De Young in Golden Gate Park, which is the collection of American art and Mesoamerican art, I think. And I mean, my life could have gone in a very different direction at this time, but it didn't because I did have this draw to the beauty and the aesthetics of medieval and Byzantine art because, like I said earlier, it was denied to me, and I'll get into this a little more in a minute. But I didn't. I went to the Castro Theater right here, which it used to be just exclusively a movie theater. Now I think they do live shows there. But when I lived in the neighborhood right up in this area, right up here, um, it just showed the old movies, like from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and I would go there because it was my high holy temple. It was my church where I could see all the films of Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, these Hollywood stars who had these tragic hagiographies. And it's not a coincidence that they were gay icons, but, they don't hear our prayers, these gay icons. Also in 1989, and this goes back to the instinctual desire for the transcendent or the holy or what is sacred. 1989, same year, Madonna released, her most important album, which was Like a Prayer, and there was the song and the accompanying video, and it really expressed a longing for what was taken away, for the sacred and the mysterious. Madonna is an Italian American. She was from the generation, prior to me. She's, I guess, more the me generation. I was Gen X. But she grew up during the revolution of the post-Vatican II era in Catholicism. And what she did in this video, especially, she reimagined a world that really no longer existed in 1989 of shrines, votive candles, holy cards, statues. These were all the things that had been stripped from the church and put in the dumpsters. There's churches here in California there where the high altars were taken out, tabernacles were taken out, statues were thrown away. Stations of the Cross were painted over. And I think she kind of expressed the longing for that. But in 89, it didn't exist. It really didn't. But 10 years later, in 1999, when I went to the TLM, it did. There was a space where that sort of traditional form of Catholicism had been revived, albeit in the catacombs. One of the things that was interesting, and I think this will be important later when I talk about TLM Catholicism. There's a sort of parallel pro, proj- there's a parallel trajectory that I see in this sort of this noble desire for what's good and holy, and it tends to collapse into squalor. I mean, you see this in this candlelight march for AIDS in San Francisco, AIDS victims, and it reminds me of processions in Roman Catholicism. One of the things that I always found striking about like gay pride in San Francisco were these floats and processions down the street, often solemn, especially during the AIDS era, that reminded me of Catholic religious processions. Is very strange. And I think this collapse, this noble pursuit for the transcendent that collapses into squalor, I think you see it in Madonna herself in later in the early 90s when she released her book Sex and Erotica, the CD and the video for Justify My Love, which became very, I think, perverse. And I think my life took a similar trajectory as hers took a very similar course. I turned to homosexuality as a traumatized boy, and I went into this insular society that I think became a surrogate for a home. I think it's one of the reasons why gay men are fascinated by the movie Wizard of Oz, with its mantra of no place like home. And I think this is why also cults or any sort of insular religious group often draws upon the lost and the disenfranchised. I think it's the same phenomena that's going on. But within these groups, including the gay male community, which I was a part of, a lot of times or most of the time, I would say the traumatized are further traumatized. And then I just really crashed. But at a weird moment, when I thought I was dying, I knew that when I thought I was dying, or I probably was dying, I knew that our Lord Jesus Christ was the one that had saved me, and I was desperate, and I didn't know what to do. And it kind of reminds me of when I was a young teenager, I was desperate and I didn't know what to do. So I went back to the Roman Catholic Church. Mhm. Now I walked, let me enlarge this picture a little bit. I walked by these churches all the time in San Francisco. And I mean, San Francisco is a very walkable city, and I think it's impossible to park there to this day, and it was no different back then. This was one of them. This is St. Agnes and the Haight-Ashbury. And for those who aren't real familiar with San Francisco, it's separated to a bunch of different neighborhoods. San Francisco is geographically not that big of a city. It's not like LA, which is spread out. There's all these different neighborhoods, and they're often separated by these hills and valleys. And so the Castro is here, and then over a hill is the Haight-Ashbury, which is famous for the Summer of Love. It was where the hippies descended during that time, and it's still kind of counterculture, although it's gentrified a lot, like a lot of these areas. And I went to St. Agnes. I had to go to a church. I knew that. I was physically, psychologically, and spiritually a wreck. I went to this church for sort of a dumb reason because it looked more traditional. Maybe it looked more like a church that was in Madonna's Like a Prayer, you know. And I talked to the priest, and he told me to find a stable monogamous relationship with another guy. And I was like, okay, been there, done that. I mean, I told him how unhappy I was in the gay life, but that was his answer. And there was an LGBT ministry group there at the church at the time. I think there still is. There's a bunch of them in San Francisco Catholic churches, as well as in New York, Chicago, LA, Seattle, name the big city, and they're there. And I said no. He was like, join the LGBT ministry and maybe you'll meet somebody. That was his answer. And unbeknownst to me, that this church, and still to this day, they do pride masses there. There's an example. Another Catholic church in the area that I walked by a lot was Most Holy Redeemer, which is like 3 blocks up from Castro Street. I mean, I walked by it 100 times. I wouldn't go there because I had an experience with one of the priests there when he officiated, excuse me, at a same-sex wedding of a friend of mine. And I overheard him after, sort of expounding on his theory of Catholicism and homosexuality and how the church should minister to gay people, especially men. And he was saying, we should marry them and not bury them. That was his theory. That I mean, I know where that kind of came from. There was a well-known Catholic priest at that time, John J. McNeil, a Jesuit, and he had written several books, The Church and the Homosexual, which were very famous. And he was saying that, I mean, he was trying to tackle the issue of AIDS. I mean, in the 80s, you couldn't talk about that topic and not, at least broach it. And he was saying that if gay men specifically had access to marriage and monogamy was promoted, that the AIDS epidemic would cease. That hasn't been the case. The majority of gay men do not marry. And then the majority of supposedly monogamous relationships amongst gay men are actually open, relationships. So it hasn't worked. And this is the interior of Most Holy Redeemer, Ugly Church. It really reflecting, I think, the liturgical changes. I've seen pictures of it um, many years before, and it had a, fairly nice altar, and everything was sort of pushed out into the middle, and everything was stripped down. Well, I found a good priest who leaned traditional. He was a Novus Ordo priest. He didn't celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. I don't think he even knew how to, because he was a post-conciliar uh, Catholic priest, and he was good in this. Well, he was good, I think, in every sense that he tried to do what was right within the institution he found himself imprisoned within. And I did go to confession to him, my first time in like 20 years. So he did help me in many, many ways. The situation that he was in was really difficult. The pastor at the parish was homosexual, and he was living with his lover, and this priest was not living at the rectory. And it was traumatizing, I think, for him. It was traumatizing for me from what I had just come from, but I was just happy that he wasn't telling me to go hook up, and he wasn't trying to pimp me out, to the gay dudes at his parish. So, I was happy. I was happy with not a lot, but it meant a lot to me at the end. Things I have to say for the priests that helped me, and I could think of probably 3 that really helped me a lot. It didn't end well for any of them. None of them tragically, actually, really. And I think just that experience affected me very, very profoundly. I can't talk about it to this day. It hurts so bad. His parish was a Novus Ordo parish. The liturgy was like a flashback for me to the 70s. in the 80s. Except it was kind of worse. They had female Eucharist ministers, altar girls, ad-libbed liturgy, just where the priest was, including stuff, whatever, not just intentions, but just weird stuff that, because I'm following in the paperback missal, and I'm like, well, where do you get this stuff? But, that's what they do. I was ready to actually leave the Catholic Church. I was going to bail. And I went to this priest and I said, Father, I'm not happy. I don't like it. So he was like, hold on, wait a minute, stop. Um, he encouraged me to go to the TLM, the traditional Latin Mass I had never heard of. And he said, okay, the liturgy, was going to be a vast improvement there. And I said, okay. So there was a fraternity of St. Peter, FSSP abbreviation. There was a fraternity of St. Peter Parish in Sacramento, which was like 80 miles, one way. And I was like, okay, it's either that or bail, because I was ready to leave. And just to kind of go on my own, I guess. I don't really remember what I was thinking about back then. It's 25 years ago. Yeah, the fraternity is, I don't, it's hard. I don't know the history of a lot of this stuff. I used to know it. After the Vatican Council and the introduction of the Novus Ordo, you had Archbishop Lefebvre, who was a French archbishop, very traditional, wanted to preserve the old rite. And he got into some trouble, I think, with the Vatican. And then there were a group of, in terms of obedience, I think. And then there were a group of priests that were kind of like, no, we want to stay regularized. We want to stay in good standing with the Pope and the church. So I think that's sort of how the Fraternity of St. Peter was formed. So I went up to Sacramento, and it was an ugly inner city parish in a sketchy area. It always happens, especially back then, because the TLM was catacomb. It was catacomized. I mean, I don't think it's that much. It's not that way anymore. Although I think it's becoming that way again. This sort of happens to, I think that I noticed this with one of the priests. It was really helpful to me. Bishops who send conservative priests into exile, sort of into the hinterlands of their diocese, kind of happens. So this sort of goes on into the catacombs. I noticed long periods of silence in the TLM, especially during like a daily mass. And that was interesting. This is where, people a lot of times historically would say their rosary or something like that. And that was interesting. And that was nice for me because I just came from the Catholic jamboree, with tambourines and guitars and drums and people dancing in the aisles. So I was done. Now on Sunday you had choirs, and here I got reintroduced to that sort of classical Western, Christian music. I said that I got introduced to Gregorian chant through the gay disco. In the 90s, there was this group called Enigma, and they had this song. I don't recall the name of it, Silence or something, but it sort of sampled Gregorian chant, and it was cool, and I always sort of liked it. And I was like, wow, this is great. But the TLM, I found it very priest centered. Here you kind of get into what I call, this is indicative, I think, in Roman Catholicism, especially modern Roman Catholicism, which is very Protestant, because as an example, you have like parish hopping, where people will move from one parish to another because there's a conservative priest there that isn't doing a clown mass, so they'll sort of follow him along. Or if another one comes up and one gets exiled, people will run from one parish to another. It's frantic, and I think it's kind of crazy. I think it makes you neurotic and it makes you paranoid. I think that happens to any sort of insular culture or group, and I did it for a while. I think you tend to have more of the parish hopping in terms of Novus Ordo Catholicism rather than the TLM, where the TLM, they just kind of get entrenched into a certain place or a parish, and it gets very bunker like, which isn't good. This is so different from Orthodoxy, which really, I wrote that the liturgy transcends the priest in Orthodoxy. And as an example, I went to an Orthodox parish where I'd been going for a while. And usually it was the same priest at this time at the liturgy, but a lot of times you don't see him till later because behind the iconostasis. And later in the liturgy, you'll see him. And I remember the liturgy going on, and I was like, oh, okay. And then the doors open, the royal doors open. It's a different priest. I was like, oh, okay. I thought it was the other priest. And I kind of thought to myself later, I was like, oh, that's cool. Because it's not like, oh, it's got to be Father so-and-so or Father this or Father that. Father so-and-so says the good mass. And it's just like, it doesn't matter. It's the liturgy is important. It's not the priest. It transcends all of that. It's another sort of interesting anecdote in terms of like the Novus Order. I remember a priest who was in ministry at that time. He's deceased now. But he said, "Oh, I didn't like it when they turned us around because in the Tridentine Mass, kind of like the Orthodox, we're all facing in the same direction. Then they turn the priest, and he's facing us, and he's like, "Oh, I felt like I had to perform." And you see that. I even had to say I saw that in the Tridentine Mass too, because the priest is so front and center, and everything's focused on him. Okay, now that I kind of got my life liturgically kind of where I was at peace, I thought I wanted some sort of ministry in the Catholic Church for someone such as myself, a person with same-sex attraction. So I did find courage. A priest helped me find that, and it was sort of back to it was back to the catacombs. It took place at this horrendous building in San Francisco. This is the cathedral for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. I think it's on Geary, which is interesting because my church, or the cathedral for the Russian Orthodox Church, is also on Geary, further down. Um, Holy Virgin Cathedral, Joyval Husaro. So that's kind of interesting. But the Courage meeting was in a basement storeroom that smelled of black mold. So I really felt, welcomed. And I had a problem with the meeting sort of right away. There was a level of denial that's, I think, indicative and endemic in Roman Catholicism that didn't really look at the true cause of the problem. There was so much recidivism amongst these guys in Courage. And, God bless them, they were trying, but they just weren't getting the help they needed in that group because it didn't look deeper. And I saw this in Roman Catholicism because it didn't look deeper into the causes of the pre-sex abuse crisis, and they still are not willing to do that. They haven't been willing to do that for 1,000 years, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I was really just tired of being embarrassment. So I started searching for a TLM, I was tired of being punished for wanting to be devout and wanting to be faithful. So I started searching for a TLM community where I would have access to the liturgy. And lo and behold, I found one in northeastern Pennsylvania. It was called the Society of St. John. This is one of these other breakaway groups. So the Fraternity of St. Peter is a breakaway group. And then the Society of St. John was a breakaway group from the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX. I'm taking a deep dive, sorry guys. The SSPX was under Archbishop Lefebvre. And I think I don't know what the canonical issues with them. Everything is legalistic in the Catholic Church, and there's some problem there. But the St. John priest broke away because they wanted to be in good standing with the Pope. So I met them and I moved back there. And the liturgy, I had access to the liturgy, which was great. And I also had spiritual direction for my SSA, which I thought was devout and good at the time. Afterwards, though, I mean, I almost immediately sense that something was seriously wrong because I saw priests constantly in the company of young men, and I didn't think from what from what I observed, I had a problem with it. I can sense things when they're not cool. I'll talk about this when 2018. So it's like almost 20 years later when I'm at a Courage meeting in Philadelphia, funny enough, just close near here, when I had the same, issue. I went to one of the priests, my spiritual director. He started gaslighting me right away. He could have taught a master class in it. He said that my past experiences in Roman Catholicism had caused me to see something that actually wasn't even there, that I was imagining it. And I wanted to trust, and I believed him, and it slowly drove me mad. If you ever watched that movie with Ingrid Bergman, called Gaslight. Yeah, it drives you crazy when people start doing that to you. And it did. So what I did was, I took off again. I keep fleeing. So I fled to France. I fled from my bad childhood to Berkeley and then San Francisco. And then I fled to the TLM and I fled from the, you know, to Pennsylvania, and I'm fleeing to France. This is a series of escapes in my life, from trauma into more and more smaller enclaves. And Fontainebleau, which here it is another one. This was a world that was beautiful. I loved it aesthetically. It was where my head was, especially the Loire Valley in France. This was Europe, and I loved the candlelight and I loved the darker. I never liked Gothic, is too airy. And I loved this sort of serious, somber, you know, with the stone statues. And so I wanted to stay. But the longer I was there, I was like, you know what? This is a world that is gone with the wind. It felt like cosplay after a while. It's just like, this is not where the Catholic Church is at all. I mean, you can play these little games in a little corner of the world, but this is not where the Catholic Church is, even under John Paul II and then later, Benedict. It just felt weird to me. It didn't feel real. So I went back to Pennsylvania and I confronted one of the priests, and that was pretty much it. That was pretty much the end because I knew that they had manipulated me and they were messing with my head, and I left. So I went back to California, and I relocated to Southern California to a TLM to a sort of a TLM where there was a TLM mass, and I had access to it. So I went there, at least on Sundays, I had access to it. And there was some good priests I knew down there as well. So, well, that I thought were good, though. That's another story. And I kind of used as my model for my faith at that point were the California missions, because I sort of believed that, and the TLM I went to was the mission. They were sort of citadels of Roman Catholicism that had endured in the midst of decadence, especially in California. So it was kind of like, I'm surviving here. But it's strange that that's what I used as my model, because the missions were essentially prisons where people were forced into conversion through fear and abuse. And that's pretty much, I didn't realize it. That's pretty much where I was. I was just hanging on in terms of fear and abuse. That's what had kept me there. And that's what sort of got me there too. Not love, not healing, none of those things. At the same time, because I was in sort of this area, I became friends with the seminarians at St. John's in Camarillo. That was the archdiocesan seminary for Los Angeles, which is the largest Catholic diocese in the United States. Over a million Catholics, excuse me. I think Cardinal Mahoney was still in charge of the diocese at that time. I met him. I've met a lot of gnarly people in my life in the different alleyways I've taken, but he was evil. Probably one of the most evil people I've ever encountered. It just radiated off of him. it was really bad. It was like a nuclear meltdown when you got close to him. Freaked me out. Um, so I back to these seminarians. They told me stories about grooming, about fishing, what I call it, into their personal lives, into their sexual thoughts and their dreams. It was very creepy, and at the time, I don't think I could articulate it or even conceptualize it in this way, but it was like very traumatizing for them. I was traumatized to be friends with them and to go there and hear about it because it sounded so sadistic and so perverse. But they wanted to stay there and go through that because they felt that they had a call from God to be priests and I guess to be manipulated and brainwashed. I don't know. I'm sorry. Sorry if Catholics are offended, be offended. I thought they were heroic at the time because I believed that there was sort of this false counterfeit church. You know, I'd heard stories about Bella Dodd, how she had placed homosexual priests into the Catholic Church and this sort of way to infiltrate and destroy the church. But if you look back at Peter Damian, he was complaining about homosexual priests in the 11th century. So it's like nothing new. Her putting a couple of gay dudes in the Catholic Church wasn't going to make that big of a difference. It was already full of them. Looking back now, if you subject yourself to that much manipulation and gaslighting, I mean, it's going to change you. And actually, I've known priests that went through this sort of process or trial by fire, and I don't think they came out good. I don't think they came out psychologically well. I think they had, one of them actually said this to me, maybe in different words, but he was like, you know, as long as I get ordained, everything's going to be different. And then they get ordained and it's worse because then they're seeing what's going on. They're seeing other priests. They're hearing about the bishop. And then they are really clamped down. They can't talk about it. I have another note here. I haven't seen that sort of psychosis in Orthodoxy because in Catholicism, where you have single men with no other really appreciable skills who are ordained into the priesthood, and they are threatened with removal of their priestly vocations. And most priests would rather remain silent, Catholic priests, than deal with the corruption that's going on in order to keep their ministry. I mean, I've actually talked to priests, Catholic priests, and said, I know A, B, and C, but if I talk about A, B, and C, I will no longer be a priest. So I feel that me being quiet is is what I need to do. Otherwise, my ministry will cease, and people who are benefiting from the ministry will no longer receive that. And that's the deal made. And I get it, but to me, it's a deal with the devil. Because in Roman Catholicism, bishops control through manipulation. This has been going on for a long time. That's why 1,000 years after Christ hung on the cross, the the Catholic Church decided that priests had to be celibate, that they enforced mandatory celibacy, because I think to a large part, those men are more easily intimidated and manipulated. There's a difference. I've just encountered a different sort of man in the Orthodox church. Well, when I was down in LA, I encountered an abusive priest, and it traumatized me pretty bad because I keep trusting these people and they keep betraying me. So I returned to the Bay Area and I kind of disappeared for a few years. I went back to the Fraternity of St. Peter. That was the only show in town at the time, or at least in the area. But by then, I knew that they had covered up for what had taken place at the Society of St. John. And that's complicated. But I knew that they did. So what I did was I went to the Society of St. Pius X. I went to the SSPX. That was kind of for traumatized people from the Novus Ordo, or no, I should say the Fraternitas St. Peter was sort of for traumatized people from the Novus Ordo, and then the SSPX sort of traumatized people from the FSSP. And then as you sort of went from the fringes to the fringes to the fringes, every time the world that I got into became more myopic, more insular, more paranoid. This emphasis on apparitions, prophecies, visions, demonology, exorcisms. This was just throughout the TLM, and it's not a cool world to be in. It makes you crazy. It made me crazy. One of the things that got me out of the SSPX, it sounds kind of trite and stupid, but it bothered me at the time, is people were walking backwards in the church because they didn't want to turn their back on the altar, or I guess the tabernacle. And I just thought this was bizarre and weird. And I was like, I don't want to be a part of a world where I feel like I have to walk backwards. I loved. And then I went to the sede vacantis, which sede vacantis is it's Latin again. I think it's for like empty chair or something like that, or I don't know. They believe that the it's also stupid. They believe that the Pope is not a legit, the current popes from I don't know who, Pius the 12th, are not legitimate. So that was that whole world. And it's like each escape that I took, it became smaller. I felt like Alice in Wonderland, where it's like, eat this, drink this. You get smaller, you go into a smaller door, and then smaller and smaller. And then each time it becomes weirder. So I remember when I was at the Sede contest, it was like no confessions. Well, I didn't know that. So I had gone to confession to an Novus Ordo priest, and I didn't go to confession to the priest there. I could have. I think I did a few times, but I just went to the Novus Ordo priest for whatever reason. And that was like, well, you can't do that because it's not valid, because they're so paranoid that they trace the genealogy of each priest, who ordained the priest, who ordained that bishop who ordained the priest, who ordained that bishop who ordained the bishop. It just becomes nuts. So I was like, I'm out of here. I'm like, Roman Catholicism eventually causes mental illness. Sorry, be offended. Like all trauma, the part about mental illness is that, I mean, this is sort of a parallel to gay men. I think trauma causes mental illness. And I don't mean that to be flippant about Catholics who've been traumatized, because I was certainly one of them. But I mean, the majority of gay men were sexually abused as children. That causes trauma and that causes mental illness, because mental illness is very high in the gay male community. And I think there's a lot of trauma in Roman Catholicism. And I think that's just a fact. Oh, here I am in the Castro. So, after laying low for a while and just trying to find a place to land, I had this interest in ministering to LGBT people. So I started the street ministry. I actually would have liked to have a home parish in the area, but no one would have me. St. Agnes wouldn't have me. Most Holy Redeemer didn't want me. So I started this street ministry, and I started hearing stories from people in that area of what was taught at these gay parishes, or most of the parishes in San Francisco. So I started looking deeper into what the Roman Catholic Church was actually teaching on the pastoral level, not what's in the catechism. The catechism isn't worth the paper it's written on, because no one is following it, especially in terms of homosexuality. And I was shocked what I found. And it doesn't matter what's written in the catechism or in some encyclical or in some letter to the bishops from the Pope. but you got to be obedient. God commanded that even if the priests, the pastors, and Christ on earth were incarnate devils, we be obedient and subject to them, not for their sakes, but for the sake of God and out of obedience to him. St. Catherine of Siena. And I kind of believed that, and that's what I was doing. Well, I started going to the LA REC, the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, which is the largest gathering of Roman Catholics in the United States, in the largest diocese in the United States. And I went to these seminars attended by laymen, teachers, DREs, catechism teachers, Catholic school teachers, priests, nuns, sisters, people who are required to go there because of their job in the Catholic Church or in a Catholic school. And I was shocked. I was actually nauseous. I had to go puke after one of these. The worst example was a priest who recommended that the people in attendance seek out misfit children, gain their trust, and then confirm an LGBT identity with them. And all this occurred under the auspices and the presence of America's bishop, Bishop Barron. Well, I tried to alert him to what was going on, and I was essentially told to shut up and obey. And then I was threatened if I didn't do that by his minions. So there you go. And some of the questions I asked, here's me with Archbishop Gomez. They played dumb. They played dumb. I would later have a meeting with Archbishop Corleone in San Francisco, and he played dumb to what was literally going on underneath his window. But that's the way they do. But I asked tough questions like, hey, why are there pride events? Oh, I was being hollered at by another priest, a gay priest at the LA Rec for daring to question what was going on. But I asked tough questions. Why are there pride masses? Why are priests wearing rainbow stoles? Excuse me. Why are there gay flags on the altar? Why are Catholic priests blessing same-sex marriages and relationships? This is before Francis gave the okay for all that. And I had nowhere to send people in my street ministry because I essentially got kicked out of one of the Catholic churches in San Francisco. I was asked to leave, and I kind of felt like, well, that's, where I am. Maybe I should leave. They're telling me to leave, but you got to keep flagellating yourself. You got to keep doing it till you bleed, till you die. So 2018 was sort of my last ditch effort to stay in the Roman Catholic Church. I attended a Courage conference, an annual Courage conference or biannual, I don't know what it is, in Pennsylvania. Odd enough. Back to the scene of the crime. It was also the year of the McCarrick scandal, the Vigano letter, the Pennsylvania grand jury, and the German bishops started blessing sodomy at that time. So I was getting close to being done. I visited a PA monastery, a Pennsylvania monastery, and that was a nice respite. I was very disillusioned with what was going on in terms of gay ministry in the Catholic Church. There was a history that had been hidden there, and that kind of all came out in 2018. Father John Harvey had ministered, I guess you could say, to pedophile priests or predator priests. Most of the time, he had recommended that they go back into the parishes, and I just it bothered me a lot. And also at that time, James Martin, the Jesuit priest, was very much in the news, and I just didn't see much or any pushback against him in the Catholic Church. And I returned to the question of why? And I started to look deeper, and I read the history of homosexuality and abuse in the Catholic Church. And it was really nothing new. This is sort of weird because when I was at when I was at UC Berkeley, I took a bunch of classes on part. And one of my favorites was the Cathedral of St. Mary Magdalene at Vézelay. And when I was at Fontainebleau, it wasn't that far. I don't know, maybe it was 100 miles or something. But I visited Vézelay because I had fallen in love with the sculpture and everything about the place. And these were columns in the church. And at the top of the column, you have a capital. And these capitals were all decorated, they were all carved. And one of them, they were all sort of odd in their different ways. But one of the strangest was this one. And I always remembered it from when I was in college because it bothered me. And I mean, now I know why it bothered me. Then I didn't know why it bothered me. But it depicts, here I'll use the cursor, it depicts the rape of Ganymede. So Ganymede, this is from Greek mythology. Ganymede was a handsome young man, and Zeus, the god Zeus, saw him, and Zeus took the form of this bird, and Zeus went to Earth and kidnapped Ganymede and raped him. And this is what we see here in this strange demon. And this is, this is 11th, 12th century, right around, not coincidentally, the time of Peter Damian. And I'm like, wow, this is what's going on. And I'm like, this is nothing new. Homosexuality and the sexual abuse of boys and young men in the Catholic Church is not a bug. That was tough for me to realize because I always thought it was a bug. I always thought it was something, an aberration that came about after the Vatican Council, after sort of these liberalization movements within the church. But actually, it's a feature. And if you go back, and there's a bunch of books that I've already done videos on this, it's a feature. It's been going on for a long time and it's endemic. And the problem is it's institutionalized. And what I mean by that is it's become part of the theology. And I've done videos on this too. And if you look at certain saints and their writings and what they said, it becomes clear what's going on, especially this sort of weird sexualization in certain female saints, like Catherine of Siena, who I mentioned, Margaret Mary is another one, Gemma Galgani. So there's sort of these odd movements in the Catholic Church, and then you have the flagellation phenomena in Roman Catholicism too. There was a weird, there was, I referenced this earlier briefly. There was a strange meeting that I had with Archbishop Corleone in San Francisco, and that was in 2019. I actually had decided to leave the church at that time, but his office had contacted me because I worked sort of in tandem with a friend of mine in ministry, especially in street ministry in San Francisco. He was my oldest friend at the time, and we went way back. And he was a very devout, loyal son of the church. I used to call him, where I wasn't. I had a lot of difficulty. He knew all this stuff was going on, but he used to just kind of put his head down and be like, "Well, this is what we're working with." And I'm like, "No." He was also not an abuse survivor. But he had really wanted to get a meeting with Archbishop Corleone, and he had been working on that for a couple of years Well, in early 2019, he died very unexpectedly. So then at the end of the year, like, I don't know, 7, 8 months later, I get a call from the archdiocese and I'm just like, F this. I don't want to have anything to do with these evil people. But then I thought, well, my dear dead friend, he really wanted this meeting. And I'm like, well, in his honor, I'll take my files and I'll take all the photos and I'll take everything there and I'll show the Archbishop. And this is kind of what it was like. It was like, yeah, whatever, you know, I don't know what you're doing. It's just like ridiculousness. I don't know anything. He knew everything. And I started looking deeper. I've shared this online. Catholics get offended. Again, be offended. They don't like this study for various reasons. 67.3% of Catholic priests identified as homosexual. You don't like that study. Go look up one of Jinkamuka's reports that he's an expert on this topic. Father Donald Cousins found that as much as 58% of priests were gay. You don't like that one. Richard Sipe, God rest his soul, he found about 30%. F- find these studies that you like and go with them. But regardless, in the general population, gay men are about 2%. So there you go. And it's been going on like this for a long time. This is not new. And what I found is that there's cover-ups even in the TLM. And this was really discouraging to me because I saw it before anything hit the internet or hit the headlines. And the lady tended to side with the accused and the abusers because they protected that insular world. And I have found that the traumatized will do anything to protect where they are and where they feel safe. And I saw this firsthand in the gay male community, and I also saw it in the TLM. This is an example from the Fraternity of St. Peter. This is an example from the Society of St. Pius X. Another one from St. Peter. And I was told when I went to the TLM initially that you'll be safe there. That doesn't go on in the traditional Latin Mass. That goes on in the Novus Ordo. And within a few months, they were wrong. But people will still say that. I still see people saying that. And they're putting innocent souls at risk. And I guess it makes them feel good to say, oh no, the bad stuff's going on over there. We don't have it. Yeah, really. I thought I was going to go it alone at this point. So I set up an icon corner in my room. And I always maintained that fascination, even as a Roman Catholic, with Eastern iconography. And even when I was, this is sort of bizarre, even when I was a gay guy, I this was after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, excuse me, early 90s, and I used to love to go to art auctions, and 90% of the time I couldn't buy anything. But I remember seeing Russian icons, and I was like, wow, and I did buy a few, and I used to drag them around with me, and I moved from place to place. Eventually, I sort of left them somewhere, but it's interesting. I always just loved them. And this is Most Holy Virgin Cathedral, Joy of All Who Sorrow in San Francisco on Geary Street. I used to drive by this building 1,000 times because it's the route that I would take to the Legion of Honor, the museum, the European museum that I was at all the time. and never paid much attention to it, didn't even know what it was or who it was or anything about it. And here's the interior of it. Actually, when I was still a Catholic, um, I went back here and I started going there, and it was just a place of peace and quiet and sacredness for me. And I felt comforted there. I didn't know anything about St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco, didn't know he was buried there, loved all the beautiful icons. And it just was a nice place for me that I kind of felt like I felt safe there. And then I started delving deep into Orthodoxy, and I discovered Father Seraphim Rose. I had actually heard about him, and I don't want to scandalize people. I had heard about him when I was gay. This is in the 90s, long after he had proposed. But I'd always heard this urban legend about a Russian Orthodox monk that had been gay, that had been homosexual, had lived in San Francisco, and then left up into Northern California into a monastery. And sure enough, you know, he was a real person. There's no one like him in Roman Catholicism. And his life paralleled mine in so many ways, but in different eras. When I read about his life, I was like, we walked the same sidewalks. We took such similar paths. And that gave me a sense of hope that other people can suffer and get lost and take different detours and end up at dead end, but they can get out of it and they can make their way. And in Orthodoxy, I also found that there was a place where devotion is not persecuted, where tradition is alive. And that word is important, alive, because the TLM always felt dead. Even at Funkambo, it felt dead. It felt like something frozen in amber. And I'm sorry, like I said, be offended, but it didn't feel alive. And I started attending the liturgy, which was it was a mixture of Slavonic and English. So it wasn't hard for me to follow along because I was used to that in the TLM with the Latin on one page and the English on the other. So this was Slavonic and English. And I liked that very much because it's not a language that you use every day. It's something outside of like pop culture and music and movies. For me, it's a restoration of the mysterious and the sacred. And only in Orthodoxy does the liturgy and the aesthetics of the church and the church itself combine so beautifully, and you do feel transported to a different reality. I mean, I think that's no more explicit than the Easter Vigil. When you go from that dark candlelit church to the brightness of Easter morning, where in the light, you can heal and find the truth, transports you to reality, another reality without the use of hallucinogenics, which is what I did a lot of. Theologically, Orthodoxy is so different. It's scholasticism versus hesychasm. It's the head versus the heart. Ultimately, it's a place of healing. And I've used the hospital analogy. Imagine a hospital that has a history of botched surgeries, malpractice. People have actually died there because of negligence. Well, you didn't know about any of that, and you were hurt and wounded, and you went there for help, and you come out worse. And then they tell you, well, you need to come back and we'll correct everything that happened to you. And you trust them, because they're in a position of authority and trust, and the same thing happens. Later, you found out that the hospital administration knew that they were employing doctors with a history of hurting, even killing people, but they didn't do anything about it. And then later you find out that in the bylaws of this hospital, they have a system of protecting people because they find those doctors easy to control and manipulate. And that's where I was. But I went to the hospital further down Geary Street. Literally, I went to the other one, down the same street, down Geary, turn right. And that's where I was. And that's where I found healing. This is a quote from Father Seraphim Rose. I love this. It's so true. Roman Catholics, in the midst of a disintegrating church structure, are finding that Orthodoxy is everything they once thought Roman Catholicism to be. Yes, everything I looked for in TLM Catholicism, I have found in Orthodoxy and more because it's alive. I wanted to end with this. There is such a level of arrogance in Roman Catholicism. As an answer to the pre-sex abuse scandal, America's Bishop Robert Barron published this book, Letter to a Suffering Church. Before getting to the substance, and I'm quoting here, before getting to the substance of this chapter, let me make one more rather blunt remark. There is simply never a good reason to leave the church. He's referring to the Catholic Church. Never. Good reasons to criticize church people? Plenty. Legitimate reasons to be angry and to be angry with corruption, stupidity, careerism, cruelty, greed, and sexual misconduct on the part of leaders of the church, you bet. But grounds for turning away from the grace of Christ in which eternal life is found? No, never, under any circumstances. So I guess I should have just stayed and died. And then he continues, therefore, let me state it bluntly. The Eucharist is the single most important reason for staying faithful to the church. You can't find it anywhere else. And no wickedness on the part of priests and bishops can affect it. Really, really. So the Catholic Church doesn't threaten non-Catholics, even non-Christians, with damnation. Hell's empty. Except the only people that are there are pre-sex abuse survivors who leave the Catholic Church. Really? Because the Catholic Church apparently owns the liturgy. That's why they could change it all they wanted. They could change the creed. No, we can change it. We can change the liturgy. We can change the creed because we own it and we own God. Really? No, that's not how it works. This is one of my favorite Russian artists, Viktor Vesnetsov. You know what? Christ, Christ, the liturgy and the Eucharist, that's not for the Catholic Church to control. And it's certainly not for these men. So I went to God in Holy Orthodoxy, where tradition has preserved the liturgy. And I think the liturgy is really where you see the truth of Orthodoxy, because in Roman Catholicism, even before the Tridentine Mass, even before the 1962 Missal, it's gone through different changes, all sorts of different manipulations, beginning with the Creed. It's where, but in Orthodoxy, you've seen things preserved in the art, in the liturgy, in the music. You've seen a preservation to a level that Catholicism can't even touch. Lastly, I just wanted to say the reason that I recorded this wasn't to wallow in my own sorrow and suffering. I mean, I've done that a lot, but over the years, I've gotten to know probably over 100, or if not more, or spoken with pre-sex abuse survivors. And except for like two or three exceptions, what I've seen is that they leave the Catholic Church, and I get that because I'm there. But what I've also seen is that many of them, give up on organized religion, and I get that too. I've been there. But they also give up on God. They lose their faith, and I think that's sad. I'm not going to judge them. I'm not going to tell them what to do. But I know that there are people out there that still have hope, and they want to believe, but they don't know really how to do it or if they should. And trust is really hard if you've experienced betrayal of any kind. And in the essay that I published on my website about this topic, I used the story of the paralytic man by Bethesda, the pool of Bethesda, because I feel like him a lot. He laid there for 38 years paralyzed because no one would help him get to the pool. The angel would travel over the pool, stir up the water, and then if you got in, you were healed. And I have felt like that, like, man, nobody's helping me. I'm just laying here, but I want to be healed. I have to say in Orthodoxy, I have found many who have been willing to help me, not just priests, because I think oftentimes healing is a community effort. I think it's not impossible to do it on your own, but I think it's certainly more difficult. So I encourage people to take a look at Orthodoxy and don't feel hopeless. Be like that paralytic man for 38 years who laid there. God bless you all.